I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the film Red, White, and Royal Blue. I'm joined today by writer and director Matthew Lopez and author of the book and executive producer of the film, Casey McQuiston. Matthew, starting with you, I know that you read the book kind of early 2020, and in directing this film and writing the script, that it sounds like you really wanted to capture the emotional response that you had to Casey's book and translating it to the screen. And I was interested in how that said about the way that you navigated adapting it to screen with that idea in mind constantly of just the feeling that you had when you first read the material.
Yeah, I always sought to recapture that emotional response I had as I was reading the book over very quickly over the course of like a day and a half as I was devouring it. And I think, one of the things that I think marks the collective response to the book around the world is that Casey wrote characters who really sort of burrow into people's hearts, and this, you know, seemingly this premise that shouldn't elicits such emotions from us, and yet it absolutely does. And so it was always about the feels. I mean, I always knew that, we would get from A to B to C to D, and I'll hit all the story points that we needed to. But if we couldn't find the emotional core of the book in the movie, we would have failed.
I love that. And off the back of that, Casey, I was interested when you were writing the book if you were thinking very specifically about that emotional experience that you wanted the audience to have, or if it was more helpful in the process just to really focus on the idea of character and story for yourself.
I think it's both. I think emotion is such a craft thing, especially in romance. Our entire toolkit is connection. It's eliciting the same emotions from the readers that the characters are feeling for each other so that you draw them in and you make them fall in love with these characters and root for the story the way that you would if it was happening to you. And so I'm always thinking about that when I'm writing. I'm always thinking about the audience reaction, and trying to weave that into how I'm crafting these arcs and when the walls come down and all of those moments of payoff.
And for both of you, it kind of it carries this classic archetype of, having this idea of conflict at the beginning and that turning into this real magnetism and then turning into a real sense of like romance and love between the two main characters. And because of that, as an audience, as a reader, you have a sense that they're most likely going to end up together at the end. So it very much becomes about the journey to get there and kind of how that happens and all the details in between. And so I was interested for both of you in how you really enjoyed the facet of like utilizing the genre, but also kind of like playing around with expectations and really making it character driven at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, Sidney Lumet in his book about filmmaking, he wrote that it's just because something is inevitable doesn't mean it has to be predictable. And I think that that pretty much explains the story. Everybody knows you're going to get together at the end, and the joy is the journey that you take to get them there. And I think that in the book, especially, and things that we try to honor in the movie, is that the journey is an unexpected one, and I think that again a lot of it has to do with the emotions. It's the unexpected emotions when someone opens up unexpectedly, when somebody reveals to the audience and to themselves how they're feeling. Um, that's the journey that I really fell in love with in the book.
Yeah, no, I think I love what you say about the unexpected, Matthew. When I sat down to write the book, it was very much rooted in archetypes and kind of tropes of characters that I was really interested in and had seen explored a lot of different ways. Like this rebellious first son, I think, was drawing from like My Date with the President's Daughter and Chasing Liberty and like these great rom-coms of the late 90s that I grew up around. And then, I mean, of course, the classic Prince Charming character. How do you subvert these two characters? What do you give them? What do you plant in them and then cultivate throughout a story, to make something go in a direction that you haven't seen before? And what I think is so incredible about watching it then be translated onto screen is that even I get to be surprised about how these characters, who are still very much the same characters at their heart, can take a little quarter turn and do something that is so true to them, but also just like pushed to the next level or pushed in a different direction in a way that still feels like them. And for me, it's like I get spoiled because I get a bit of emotional payoff out of that myself.
I love that that was the experience. And, you know, Matthew, off the back that Casey's bringing up, the fact that you have these kind of two different archetypes of characters, it also means that as a filmmaker, you have two different worlds to build out visually, and they really kind of have their own styles and flourish. And in essence, almost a little bit more with Alex, because you have his world as it is in the day to day, and then you have his family home down in Texas, which gives you yet another space to play with. And so when you were thinking about the way that you wanted to build both of these worlds as different visual spaces, how did you set about starting that and figuring out all the details?
It really started first with conversations with my production designer, and you know, in adapting the novel, I knew every screenwriter wants, I think, at some point in their career to write the words interior Oval Office. That was an amazing thing to be able to play with as a writer, and then interior Buckingham Palace. And I remember saying to people, I said, listen, I can boil this down to like the fact that I'm writing a script that has both scenes set inside the Oval Office and inside Buckingham Palace, and you know, and then when you turn that into actual filmmaking, yeah, the first conversations I had with my production designer are like, uh, how do we differentiate the two spaces, the two worlds, and yet also deliver, you know, the grandeur of them. You know, there is genuine literal majesty to all these palaces, and then there is sort of the grandeur of the White House and DC. Uh, but most importantly, we couldn't just sort of show pretty rooms. What I always said about this film was that it was young people in old buildings, and that the youth, the energy of youth, the rebelliousness of youth, you actually have to watch these two young men straining against the confines of these beautiful spaces that they're in.
Was that similar for you, Casey? Because obviously you're building these two worlds in the world of literature, so it's a very different approach and way that you're doing it. And so, how was the way that you thought about building these two different worlds on the page around each of the characters?
I mean, it was really, honestly, it was a lot of research, but it was really fun, nerdy research. I mean, I'm really fascinated with like the idea of the gilded cage, and B, the idea of these secret rooms where the most important things in history happen and nobody's even allowed to see what the inside of the room looks like Buckingham Palace, or like parts of the White House. And I'm nosy. So it was really fun to get to do the research where I was spending hours on like a 3D historical map of the White House, and like here's each room and what it has been throughout the decades to different administrations. And you know, like the solarium on the roof of the White House was once like a room, I think it was Taft's family slept in it on hot days because it had like no windows and they didn't have air conditioning, and it was DC, and so the breeze would come through and waft the curtains and cool his family down on hot nights. I mean, that kind of stuff is, I eat it up. It's delicious. And so it was so much. It was a challenge, but it was a really delightful challenge to do all of that research. And I mean, probably to a fault, wanted to put every bit, every morsel of that in. But I think that's what makes it such like a rich playground to get to explore, and for the reader to really immerse themselves in and feel like they're inside of. It's really hard to make these sort of hyper real fantastical worlds feel relatable and accessible to a reader who's, you know, a person in the world. And so I find the more details you give it, the more grounded it feels, the more it feels like something you can step inside of. And so the work pays off in that way.
It's also super interesting because you have these two characters that are living in this world of privilege, and yet it's also a place that is a connective space for them, and it's also something that's very different because Alex doesn't come from that background originally. You know, he comes from more of a working class background in Texas, but at the same time, he's now the first son of the president of the United States, and so he is existing in that bubble. And I think there's so many ways in which they have similarities and differences that kind of give them a lot to play with. And so, how did you both find in shaping these characters that you had a lot of commonalities, and sometimes there are ways that like the two of them wouldn't necessarily realize that they have more in common than they think?
Oh, I mean, so when I first started coming up with the idea of Alex, my very first iteration of him, like the first time I imagined him, I'm like, okay, I want him to be sort of like a young Kennedy. So maybe his family is from like Cape Cod, Nantucket, something like that, kind of like preppy American legacy type of thing. And then I was just so bored by that and could not find my way into it at all. I was like, I don't know anything about these people. I'm from Southern Louisiana. My family's like Cajun all the way back. And I was like, what if they're like just like Texas, like populist Democrats? Like they're cowboy hats and Shiner and tamales, and they are the small little family who sort of against all odds, like I rose up into the upper echelons of politics. That is so much more interesting to me, and that is so much more accessible to me as someone from the South and something I can write toward. And I found it really, really fun and rewarding to write toward. Because I got to get on my little soapbox about progressive people and queer people and trans people in red states and how they're forgotten. And it was delightful. And then that I feel like put Alex in such counterpoint to Henry and this like blue blood, aristocratic background that he had. And that really just, I felt elevated the clash between them in the beginning and how far they would have to come to meet in the middle.
Was that similar for you, Matthew, in terms of how you feel like it elevated like the clash that they had at the beginning and how they came together?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that opening scene in the car with Alex and Nora, and he says, I can't. I'm being asked to compete with this guy in some ways. I'm being compared to this guy in some ways, but it's really unfair because he's had his whole life to prepare for this, and I'm like 3 years into this, right? And so for me, while their lives were incredibly different, and while Alex's current life resembles Henry's in so many ways, what ultimately those things don't really define them. They're defined by their nature, they're defined by their hearts, and there's just these two little interlocking pieces that of these two very different people, and this thing that just sort of connects them. And one of the things that I've always felt this film was about was two people transcending expectations of them, and the love that they have for each other is the thing that unlocks that ability to transcend where they come from and what the expectations of them are on them by the outside world.
Definitely. And Casey, when you were writing the book as well, did you kind of find a natural progression in those touch points of where you wanted the emotion to kind of become more vulnerable and more intimate between the two of them? Because there's kind of certain steps that they take that kind of gradually bring them closer together, but there's still a little bit of push and pull throughout the whole story as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to like good old classic three-act structure, breaking it down into these little mini beats of like, set up conflict resolution that like escalates and builds. And so in like, I want to say I planned it that way. I want to say I did that very intentionally, but I think it just kind of happened. I think they kind of told me what they wanted to do. They just have this. This is gonna sound like I'm so full of it, but there is this way like when you really come up with when like lightning strikes and you have those two characters that have like come to you, they kind of tell you what they want to do, and they kind of like the way that their natures and their personalities kind of unfold as you're writing them inform, how will you respond to this push? How will this trigger move you to the next thing? And so I felt like it developed really organically for me as I was writing, because these are two people who are deeply passionate and intense people in different ways. And so there was always a very clear answer for how each would react to the next thing, which was fun.
No, it's so great when those moments happen. And in writing and directing the film, did you find that the structure that Casey had created in the book kind of gave you that natural progression, or were you still kind of playing around with it a little bit in the writing process and even in the editing suite when you were putting together that first rough cut of the film?
Yeah, I mean, the structure was very much a gift from Casey to be in terms of there was a very clear journey, and I've said this in other interviews that the biggest challenge I had was just what couldn't I put into the film, because I Casey had 400 pages and I had 2 hours, and the I was never ever at a loss for how the journey would go because it was so clearly laid out for me in the novel. The challenge really was is just how much could I get in without overstuffing it, and how much could I actually tell? How much of the story could I actually tell? And I realized that it was just the simple yes or no question of like, is does this further Alex and Henry's story? Yes or no? Does it help me understand Alex and Henry's individual heart and then their collective relationship? Yes or no? And that became a necessary metric that I had to use in order to tell the story. But in terms of the beginning, middle, of the end, in terms of who they are at the beginning, how this journey changes them and how where they end up, that was gifted to me by Casey, and I got to follow their lead on that.
And Matthew, I also wanted to ask you about the coming out scene when Alex tells his mom, played by Uma Thurman, because I thought it was such a beautiful moment. Just the fact that she's like, "Hey, I'm going to need some time. Let's order some pizza. Let's just sit on the couch and talk, and I'm going to clear my schedule so that I can just sit here and listen to you, and you can tell me
Mm.
anything that you need to." And I thought it was so beautifully kind of captured and played. And I was interested in just how you approach going into a scene like that that you knew was so important for that character.
Yeah, that Casey and I actually talked about this recently. Like in the novel, that is a good example of where I had to sort of go in a different direction from the novel. And in the novel, it's played for comedy in many ways, and Ellen makes a PowerPoint presentation and has time to prepare one, and I knew that the engine of film story wasn't going to allow me to take that break. I just needed to keep going, and so um, Ellen had to sort of approach this scene completely unawares, completely taken off guard by it, and just go. So uh, for me, what that scene ended up being, as I was writing it, and then as I started to work on set with Uma and Taylor, it really ended up being the scene that I wish that when I'd had with my parents when I came out to them in the '90s, they late '90s, I should say, very very late '90s, like so late into the '90s it was practically midnight
New Year's Eve,
on New Year's
1999.
Eve. That's right. And I really wanted to gift to the queer audience the kind of ultimate badass mom response, right? And I followed Casey's lead, and I just gave Ellen like the thing that I think I would have loved to have heard from my mom. But my mom at that time was just, that wasn't something that was available to her. I think she's a lot closer to Ellen now. But I needed that. I wanted Ellen to be as spectacular as Uma plays her in the film, of just like and I wanted to be like, and that's my president, right? That 1-2 punch of mom being that cool and the president being that cool.
And lastly, for you, Casey, you've had such a deep and long relationship with this book that you've created, and now you've had the opportunity to kind of see it go out into the world with readers, but then also to see how Matthew's imagination captured it on screen. And so, how do you feel like that's expanded and evolved the relationship that you have with your own book and your own writing and work?
That's such a good question. I mean, it it's I'm like struggling to come up with words. I guess I would start by saying I recently reread the Lord of the Rings series for the first time in a long time. And
Mm.
I realized how much they changed the character of Aragorn's arc. And it showed me, and this was like before the movie came out, but it showed me that sometimes changes that are made for a movie are good and even better than the original because it's a movie. And a movie has to be a movie and a book has to be a book. And 400 pages of book is never going to be an hour and a half to 2 hours of a movie. And as an author, I think we can be a little precious about, well, this is what I wrote and this is what I've been attached to. I started writing this book in early 2016, so like 8 years ago. And for all of those years, it was this way in my head, and it was, there was never a different way. And then you start to figure out that the heart of it is really what matters. And if you read the script and you feel like the heart of what you wrote is in there and the characters are getting from their point A to their point B, and the same point A that you believe in and the same point B that you believe in, but like a few little turns are different along the way, that it can actually be this really beautiful transformative way to tell the story, that kind of, even for me, even for readers, can open up a different way to appreciate it, a different way to like love these characters, and love the story that they're inside. And it was honestly a really freeing thing to realize and to experience, because suddenly you're like, what an amazing, expansive piece of art that can now be more than me. It kind of takes the pressure off me a little bit, because I'm like, wow, like there's so many different versions of this story. There's so many different angles and so many different facets that you can like find yourself in or plug into. And that I think is really beautiful and makes me appreciate this whole process so much more.
I love that. Well, congratulations on all of the success of the book and the continued evolution into the movie and everything with the film. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.